A Soviet intelligence officer walks into a Western embassy, clutching a briefcase and demanding asylum. Within hours, a Cold War chessboard erupts into chaos. He's not just another defector. He's carrying secrets, names, and a threat. Viktor Baranov was never meant to be famous. He wasn't the kind of spy you read about in novels. No shootouts, no flashy disguises, just quiet corridors, tapped phone lines, and the steady hum of paranoia. For 2 decades, he served as one of the KGB's most trusted counterintelligence officers in East Berlin, a man who hunted traitors, sniffed out leaks, and erased problems before they became headlines. His file was clean, his loyalty unquestioned, his presence almost mythological. But in 1980, Viktor did the unthinkable. He turned, not just against his handlers, but against the very system that created him. And in doing so, he lit a fuse that almost blew apart the Cold War. For nearly 2 decades, Viktor Baranov had been the embodiment of silent loyalty, a shadow among shadows in East Berlin's KGB directorate, his work buried in code names and dossiers, his name rarely spoken aloud, even among colleagues, as if uttering it might summon him from the mist. He was efficient, cold, and deeply trusted, assigned to monitor suspected Western infiltrations, interrogate defectors, and audit internal loyalty reports across Warsaw Pact territories. His hands were clean, but his eyes had seen enough betrayals, denouncements, and sudden disappearances to understand that the most dangerous threats often came from within. By the mid-1970s, something in him began to shift, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A delay in signing off on routine wiretap summaries, a longer pause when reading memos from the Kremlin, a growing awareness that the cause he'd served so faithfully was devouring its own children. The moment of fracture came in 1978, when his closest friend in the service, Lieutenant Colonel Alexei Sidorov, failed to report for duty. At first, it was brushed off as a personal leave. Then the whispers started, questioned by internal, possible leak, compromised source. Within days, Sidorov's office had been sealed, his apartment cleared, and his name purged from the personnel database. No explanation, no funeral, no closure. Viktor understood the code. Sidorov had either seen something he wasn't meant to, or had become a liability to someone higher up. And just like that, he was gone, erased. It shook Viktor more than he let on. The 2 men had trained together in Minsk, risen through the same bureaucratic labyrinth, shared cigarettes and silence after long nights of interrogations. If Sidorov could vanish, so could anyone. That realization became the first crack in Viktor's ideological armor. He began photographing select documents, slowly, methodically, with a smuggled Minox camera, its shutter no louder than a breath. Not the obvious top-level secrets, but things that might seem harmless on their own. Personnel rosters, surveillance logs, reports about compromised East German assets, notes from Moscow about growing concern over CIA penetrations in Prague and Warsaw. He kept the film hidden in false bottom drawers and hollowed-out binders, not passing them to anyone, just storing them, collecting, watching. Whether it was a contingency plan, an insurance policy, or the slow birth of betrayal, even Viktor couldn't say yet. But the KGB's message had been clear. Loyalty offered no protection. Every man was expendable, every friendship conditional. In that quiet, lonely paranoia, Viktor crossed a line that would never uncross. He had not yet defected. He had not yet spoken to the enemy, but he had stepped into the cold space between belief and survival, where a man waits for the knife and wonders if he'll use it first. From that moment on, Viktor Baranov was no longer just watching enemies of the state. He was becoming one, and the only question left was how far he'd go before someone noticed the ghost inside the machine. On a gray, windswept afternoon in March 1980, a man in a dark overcoat stepped across the cobblestones of Boltzmanngasse in Vienna. His pace unhurried, his face buried beneath a brimmed fedora, and the collar of his coat raised high against the chill, carrying a black leather briefcase with a grip so tight his knuckles paled. He passed the security checkpoint at the U.S. Embassy with a calm authority that drew no suspicion, gave a false name, and asked to speak with the CIA station chief. Alone. Moments later, behind reinforced doors and a heavy curtain of distrust, the man removed his hat, revealing the worn, sharp features of Viktor Baranov, a name known in Langley but never expected to be uttered inside friendly walls. He placed the briefcase on the table, clicked it open, and unfolded a series of documents, typed in Russian and German, stamped with Soviet seals, some with red-bordered top-secret warnings from the KGB's main directorate. One folder contained dossiers on double agents embedded in NATO operations across West Germany and Belgium, including 2 names already suspected and 3 that had never appeared on any Western radar. Another set of files detailed internal audits of Stasi-KGB coordination meetings, revealing cracks in the East German network and vulnerabilities that hadn't been exploited yet. But the final item, the one that stopped the CIA officers in the room from blinking, was a single handwritten letter in English. "I have more. I want out. VB." The room went silent. Viktor didn't speak. He merely watched as the men flipped page after page, cross-referencing code names and intel trails, their expressions shifting from professional precision to something close to awe, because this wasn't some disillusioned low-level translator or a bribed border guard. It was Baranov, the KGB's own ghost, a man long believed to be ideologically immovable and structurally untouchable. And now he was here, offering to bleed out the Kremlin's veins for safe passage west. The CIA scrambled. Secure communications were lit up from Vienna to Langley to West Berlin. Verifications were demanded, authentication codes cross-checked. Within hours, the embassy was locked down, guards doubled, surveillance wiped clean from the front gate to the inner hallways. Viktor was taken to a secure basement level, interrogated gently but thoroughly. What did he want? Why now? How could they trust him? He answered minimally, always circling back to the same chilling sentence. "The system is eating itself. I no longer wish to be on the menu." As confirmation trickled in, matching descriptions, code word validation, handwriting analysis, it became unmistakably clear. Viktor Baranov had not only defected, he had detonated the single most devastating breach in Soviet intelligence since the war began. And this was just the beginning. The briefcase he'd brought with him was a match lit near dry tinder. The fire it would spark would not stay confined to documents and corridors. It would reach borders, cabinets, entire alliances. And back in Moscow, the realization that one of their most dangerous minds had flipped would send shockwaves through the Politburo that no firewall could contain. The moment Viktor Baranov's defection was confirmed, the CIA didn't hesitate. The Vienna station relayed a code-red transmission to Langley, and within 6 hours, an emergency extraction protocol was activated under the codename Operation Backfire, a title born from the understanding that if anything went wrong, the blowback would be nuclear, not metaphorically, but geopolitically. The initial plan was swift and clinical. Viktor would be moved to a CIA safehouse disguised as a diplomat's residence just outside the city center, guarded by 2 armed agents under false diplomatic covers, while a decoy vehicle followed a mirrored route to the Swiss border, carrying a man wearing Baranov's coat, hat, and signature briefcase. Meanwhile, Vienna's embassy staff were ordered into silent mode, comms encrypted at the highest clearance level, and the ambassador himself was kept in the dark under plausible deniability protocols. Inside the safehouse, Viktor was questioned relentlessly, not tortured, but poked at from every angle, psychological, procedural, ideological, by field officers flown in from Berlin and Paris. They were under strict orders: verify everything, confirm code names, test his knowledge of prior operations, identify names that hadn't yet been leaked in any known breach. And while Baranov answered everything with unnerving precision and calm, somewhere deep inside CIA headquarters, doubt still whispered its ugly questions. Could this be a Soviet disinformation plant? Was Viktor Baranov real, or the sharpest hook the KGB had ever baited? But what the Americans didn't know was that 2 days prior to Viktor's arrival at the embassy, a nondescript woman in a wool coat had spotted him walking through the 9th District, heading toward Boltzmann-Gasse, and had made a call, not to the Austrian police, but to a listening post operated by Directorate S out of Prague. A low-priority surveillance file had flagged Viktor's travel clearance weeks earlier. He wasn't supposed to be outside East Berlin unless on assignment, and while no immediate action had been taken, the call changed everything. Within 12 hours of Viktor's defection, Moscow had dispatched a 6-man Zaslan unit to Vienna under diplomatic cover, their job not to negotiate, not to warn, but to retrieve or eliminate. KGB surveillance teams had already placed 2 watchers outside the U.S. Embassy and begun tracing every car that exited the compound. When the CIA decoy left with the briefcase, a black Volga shadowed it all the way to the western outskirts of the city before realizing it had been duped. But by then, it was too late. The Soviets knew the real Viktor hadn't left yet. Inside Vienna, a tightening net was forming. Operation Backfire was moving under the assumption that they had time, that secrecy still shielded them. But every phone tapped, every diplomatic car tagged, every agent's shadow noted. The Soviets weren't merely watching, they were hunting. And as the CIA scrambled to adjust exfil routes and secure air corridors, they had yet to realize that Operation Backfire was no longer a plan. It was a race. And Viktor Baranov, the man they hoped would save the West's intelligence credibility, had just become the most wanted human asset on the planet. Before Viktor Baranov could even be smuggled across the Austrian border, Moscow struck back with calculated fury, launching what would become the most aggressive counterintelligence purge in the Eastern Bloc since the early 1950s. Within 48 hours of Viktor's defection, suspected Western operatives were rounded up in East Berlin, Warsaw, Budapest, and Prague, men and women whose names, affiliations, or movements had shown up in the very documents Viktor had photographed and now offered to the CIA. In East Germany alone, 6 mid-level informants disappeared overnight. 2 were later reported dead under medical complications in state custody, though no autopsies were performed and no families notified. The KGB's counterstrike wasn't just a reaction. It was a calculated performance for both internal and external audiences, a brutal reaffirmation that betrayal would be met with immediate reckoning. Soviet state media began churning out vague yet ominous statements about escalating Western subversion efforts, and traitorous elements embedded within loyal socialist nations, never naming Baranov, but making it abundantly clear that someone high up had vanished, and that someone would pay. In diplomatic circles, the USSR accused the United States of orchestrating a campaign of unlawful abductions and espionage provocations designed to destabilize peaceful socialist regimes. The rhetoric grew hotter by the hour, and at a hastily called emergency session of the Warsaw Pact Security Council, Marshal Ustinov, Minister of Defense, personally ordered a directive placing all Soviet-aligned intelligence units on high alert and greenlighting Operation Glass Scythe, a covert plan to sever and reconstitute any potentially compromised networks across Europe. Meanwhile, inside KGB headquarters on Lubyanka Square, Baranov's file was sealed under Level 5 classification and labeled with a single word in red ink: Izmennik, traitor. His former colleagues were summoned, interrogated, audited. Those who had worked with him most closely were quietly reassigned or demoted, their access revoked without explanation. Baranov's family, his sister in Riga, his ex-wife in Minsk, even his aging father, were taken in for questioning, their homes searched for anything that might suggest premeditation. Publicly, Baranov's name was never mentioned. His disappearance was recorded in the archives as an unsanctioned leave of absence, a bureaucratic euphemism designed to erase him. But behind closed doors, his betrayal sent tremors through the hierarchy of Soviet intelligence. If a man like Viktor, polished, promoted, and protected, could defect, then anyone could. Panic metastasized beneath the surface. Surveillance increased not only on known foreign agents, but on Soviet operatives themselves, creating a paranoid feedback loop that paralyzed operations from Bucharest to Sofia. Every KGB residentura in the West was ordered to halt recruitment efforts and report in, while internal loyalty reviews ballooned into full-blown purges. And as the net widened, so did the scope of retaliation. One Canadian diplomat was expelled from East Germany for unacceptable associations. A West German journalist was arrested in Budapest and accused of aiding Western intelligence. Back in Vienna, the CIA was still finalizing Viktor's extraction route, unaware that the damage had already metastasized, and that the Soviet machine had no intention of letting Baranov disappear into the night without turning Europe into a pressure cooker. The Cold War had just found a new flashpoint, and his name was Viktor Baranov. As the classified contents of Viktor Baranov's briefcase rippled through the upper echelons of Langley, Unease began to spread like ink in water, not because the information lacked substance, but because it had too much. Everything about Baranov's defection was textbook, and that's what made it terrifying. The files he'd provided were rich with actionable intelligence, operational timelines, covert agent aliases, technical specs of surveillance methods used in Bonn and Paris, even a breakdown of signal protocols employed by embedded Soviet moles within NATO communications infrastructure. But it was too perfect. For some of the agency's old Cold War operatives, especially those who'd spent time dancing with KGB ghosts in Berlin and Prague, this smelled wrong. Not like a genuine escape, but like an offering, a lure. The theory began quietly, whispered first between two mid-tier analysts over coffee in the skiff, then muttered by an operations lead during a closed-door session at Counterintelligence Division HQ. What if Viktor wasn't running from the KGB? What if he was sent? Designed to be the ideal defector, credible, scared, well-connected, and bearing gifts just enticing enough to command trust, but just dangerous enough to expose how NATO might react under stress? Was Viktor's real mission not to betray Moscow, but to provoke a counter-response that would smoke out Western sources, perhaps even reveal who in NATO had the authority to verify the kind of intel Viktor offered? Doubt metastasized fast. CIA Director Stanfield wanted answers and quietly assigned an internal task force to audit the Vienna operation under the pretense of post-defection risk analysis. But internally, it was known as Red Echo, a deep dive into every interaction, transcript, and micro-expression Viktor had shown since stepping inside the embassy. Their findings were inconclusive, and that only made things worse. Viktor's behavior was cooperative, but guarded. He was open, but never desperate. His answers were clean, never rehearsed, but never sloppy. It was espionage perfection, and that terrified the agency more than a screaming liar ever could. If this was a KGB setup, it was masterwork. If it wasn't, they might be about to blow the most valuable defection in decades. Meetings in Langley turned tense. Briefings were paused mid-sentence by silent glances and second thoughts. A once unified extraction team split into factions, those who believed Viktor was genuine, and those who now referred to him simply as the Trojan. The paranoia bled into the Vienna station itself. One handler began sleeping with a pistol under his pillow. Another demanded that all future conversations with Viktor be recorded through back-channel surveillance, in case the official transcripts were compromised. And yet, through all this, Viktor never wavered. He ate, slept, responded to questions, and waited. Not with fear, not with urgency, but with patience. The kind of patience that either belonged to a man who knew he was finally free, or one who knew his trap was working exactly as planned. The CIA had asked for truth. Instead, they now had a paradox wrapped in a defection, one that threatened to implode the very trust their entire counterintelligence network relied on. The news hit Langley like a detonation. A senior NATO communications director in Brussels, someone with decades of spotless service, had been arrested by Belgian counterintelligence after evidence surfaced, proving he'd been feeding encrypted briefings to the Soviets for years, and the smoking gun came directly from Viktor Baranov's documents. At first, the CIA took it as confirmation that Viktor was genuine. This mole had been a ghost, suspected only in vague whispers, but never pinned to anything solid. Yet within hours, that celebration curdled into dread when an intercepted KGB cable revealed something impossible. The Soviets had already evacuated the mole's handler and sanitized the Brussels safe house before NATO made its move, as if they'd known the arrest was coming. That meant the KGB had advance warning. That meant Viktor's materials weren't just exposing spies, they were exposing which spies the CIA was acting on. That meant someone inside the CIA had tipped Moscow off about the West's reaction to Viktor's intel. Suddenly, the impossible took shape. Not only was there a leak in the West, but that leak now compromised Viktor's chances of survival at every step. In Vienna, the extraction team realized that the KGB shouldn't have had enough time to relocate assets, burn documents, or issue internal cancellations unless someone high-level inside Langley, or inside the NATO intelligence chain, had alerted them that the Baranov briefcase was real. The implications were explosive. If Viktor wasn't a double agent, someone else was, and that someone now saw Viktor not as a surrendered defector, but as a liability whose continued existence threatened to unravel a deep Western betrayal. Inside the CIA station, paranoia turned radioactive. The Vienna chief demanded new authentication protocols for every cable, even those marked urgent. A full internal sweep was ordered, but even that decision triggered suspicion. What if the mole was on the sweep team itself? Meanwhile, Viktor sensed the shift immediately. His handlers grew stiff, their questions sharper, their tone less reassuring. One wouldn't meet his eyes at all. Another subtly moved their chair closer to the door, as if expecting him to attack. Viktor understood what they didn't dare say aloud. They no longer knew who to trust, and that included him. If the Soviets had preemptive knowledge of the Brussels arrest, they might already know Viktor had defected. They might already have sent operatives to silence him. But now, Viktor faced a second threat. The CIA, terrified of a mole inside their own walls, might decide that eliminating the unpredictable defector was the safest play. After all, a dead defector can't contradict anyone's story. For the first time, Viktor found himself trapped between two superpowers who, in different ways, were converging on a single conclusion. He was too dangerous to be allowed to live. And somewhere in Brussels, as a disgraced NATO official was dragged away in handcuffs, a far more insidious truth settled over the intelligence community. The war wasn't just East versus West anymore. It was now West versus West, shadow versus shadow, betrayal feeding betrayal. And Viktor Baranov had become the spark threatening to ignite all of it. Diplomacy, already brittle beneath decades of Cold War tension, began to crack almost immediately after whispers of Viktor Baranov's defection leaked into intelligence circles across Europe. Within days, the Soviet Union publicly accused the United States of violating the Helsinki Accords, framing the defection not as an act of political asylum, but as a criminal abduction of a loyal Soviet officer, a calculated provocation under the guise of diplomacy. The language used in Pravda was surgical, imperialist aggression, unlawful detainment, destabilization by espionage. But behind the words, the message was simpler. We know what you did. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just 2 weeks before, both superpowers had been preparing for a long-awaited arms limitation summit in Vienna, one meant to revisit and possibly de-escalate elements of the SALT II framework. That summit was now suspended indefinitely, with the Soviet delegation withdrawing in protest, citing bad faith actions by American operatives on foreign soil. Behind closed doors, Soviet diplomats stormed out of UN sessions in Geneva. In East Berlin, where paranoia had replaced protocol, the Stasi raised border alert status to red, heightened security at Checkpoint Charlie, additional guards stationed at the Berlin Wall, orders to interrogate any East German citizen attempting to leave without clearance. Across the Iron Curtain, Western embassies began evacuating non-essential personnel. U.S. and British consulates in Warsaw and Bucharest burned backup document caches and destroyed cryptographic equipment, just in case. In Brussels, the recent arrest of the NATO mole created a cascading effect. France and West Germany froze joint intelligence operations temporarily, unwilling to share classified material until internal security reviews were complete. Meanwhile, Soviet warships in the Baltic moved closer to Finnish and Swedish waters than they had in years, sending a silent message that Moscow was willing to posture with more than words. The world hadn't seen this level of coordinated diplomatic recoil since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at the heart of it, cloaked in silence inside a CIA-run safe house in Vienna, sat Viktor Baranov, watched like a bomb with a ticking heart. Every move he'd made, every page of intel he'd turned over, had triggered consequences on a scale even he hadn't predicted. The irony wasn't lost on him. For decades he had worked behind the curtain, keeping geopolitical balance intact by identifying threats to Soviet control. Now, by stepping out of the shadows, he had thrown a match onto the most delicate equilibrium of the 20th century. Neither side could admit the truth publicly. To admit Viktor's defection was to admit the Soviets had been infiltrated at the highest level. To admit the mole arrest was tied to Baranov was to admit the West had used a defector's testimony to expose active operations. So, instead, both powers dug in, publicly posturing, privately panicking. The Cold War had never gone away. It had only slept. And now, thanks to one man with a briefcase, it had jolted awake, teeth bared, closer to the brink than it had been in years. On the morning of April 3, 1980, Viktor Baranov was scheduled to be transferred from the CIA safe house in Vienna to a covert airfield near Linz, where a chartered jet under diplomatic cover would ferry him to West Germany, then to Langley for full debriefing and protective relocation. But he never arrived at the airstrip, and by 00:08 hours, Operation Backfire was in shambles. The safe house was found undisturbed. No forced entry, no broken locks, no signs of struggle. The guards on duty claimed they had stepped out only momentarily, one to smoke, the other to retrieve encrypted comms equipment from a car parked a block away. And when they returned, Viktor was gone. His room was untouched, his suitcase still packed, but his coat, identification, and one of the document folders were missing. Panic spread through this Vienna station like wildfire. Within an hour, every checkpoint in Austria was alerted. Border patrols intensified. Surveillance footage from the area was pulled. Agents were dispatched to monitor the usual KGB dead drop locations. But there was nothing. No sightings, no chatter, just a void where a man had once been. Theories multiplied faster than facts. Some within the CIA believed Viktor had been snatched in a precision KGB snatch and grab, bundled into a diplomatic vehicle, and whisked across the border under cover of immunity before anyone realized he was gone. Others whispered darker possibilities, that someone inside Langley, perhaps tied to the mole in Brussels, had leaked the exfiltration timetable and arranged Viktor's death to bury what he knew. But the most disturbing theory was the one no one could prove or disprove, that the CIA had intentionally disappeared Viktor, faked the snatch, and buried him deep within their own shadows, giving him a new name, a new face, and a lifetime of silence in exchange for what he knew, a classified ghost, never to be seen again. But outside the intelligence halls, more radical stories spread, stories suggesting Viktor Baranov never existed at all, that he was a fabrication designed to justify a purge inside NATO, an invented defector whose documents were forged to trigger a chain reaction of arrests, reorganizations, and budget expansions across Western intelligence. Journalists began asking questions, but every request for comment was met with tight-lipped denials or vague non-statements about ongoing diplomatic concerns. In Moscow, the KGB publicly declared they had no knowledge of a Major Viktor Baranov ever existing, labeling the entire saga an elaborate Western fiction designed to discredit socialist governance. But in whispered corridors, KGB officers scrambled for answers. They knew Baranov had been real, and they also knew he had vanished without leaving a body, a trail, or a truth that anyone could hold on to. The Americans closed the Vienna station for renovations. The Brussels investigation went quiet. The arms summit was postponed, indefinitely. And the man who had nearly cracked the Cold War wide open was no longer in the files, only in the footnotes. Viktor Baranov had become the rarest kind of defector, not merely lost, but unprovable. A myth born from reality or a reality consumed by myth. Either way, he was gone. In the spring of 2009, a tranche of Cold War-era documents was quietly declassified by the CIA under a routine transparency directive, buried among thousands of pages concerning long-forgotten operations, surveillance reports, and diplomatic briefings from the 1970s and 80s. But hidden in those pages was confirmation of something intelligence scholars had debated for decades. Viktor Baranov had been real. His name appeared in black ink, partially redacted but unmistakable, alongside a document labeled Asset V12 Prism Echo, and attached to it was a classified internal memo dated July 1980, acknowledging that Baranov's intelligence had directly led to the exposure of 3 high-ranking Soviet double agents embedded within Western command structures, one in Belgium, one in Denmark, and one in Greece, each of whom had been quietly removed from their posts under the guise of retirement or reassignment. Another report detailed the dismantling of a covert Soviet surveillance network operating out of Milan, a network responsible for siphoning NATO troop movements and decrypting Western communication chains for nearly 7 years. The file credited foreign-sourced intelligence, verified through HUMINT, and while Viktor's name was never stated explicitly, cross-references matched the timeline and data format to the very briefcase he had brought to the U.S. Embassy in Vienna. But more chilling than the tactical victories was the fallout documented in the weeks after his disappearance. The summit cancellations, the aggressive realignment of Soviet military exercises, the brief but serious risk of a rupture between the United States and France over suspected infiltration of their joint SIGINT program. all outcomes of a defection that could not be explained, and a man whose fate no agency could conclusively confirm. Though the files corroborated Viktor's existence and the weight of what he offered, they stopped short of explaining where he went. No exfiltration logs, no alias transfers, no post-defection housing placements. Just a single handwritten margin note, scrawled in blue ink by an unknown analyst. Last visual, LR04-0280, Vienna. No recovery, asset presumed burned. But even that phrasing left room for interpretation. Burned by whom? His enemies, or his handlers? Over the years, the intelligence community would whisper theories, each more speculative than the last. That Viktor had been relocated under deep cover in South America, living under a new identity in a village no one could spell. That he had been assassinated not by the KGB, but by a rogue element within the CIA who feared the political consequences of his knowledge. That he had fled both sides and died a nameless man somewhere in the Alps, tired of being a pawn in a game he no longer believed in. The only certainty was the legacy he left behind. A single defection that shattered enemy operations, exposed vulnerabilities on both sides, and sent a ripple through the cold, war that no one could fully trace or undo. Viktor Baranov may have disappeared, but his ghost-haunted diplomatic cables, personnel audits, and declassified fragments for decades. A name that could not be confirmed aloud, yet refused to vanish completely. In the end, he became what every spy secretly dreams and dreads of becoming. An unresolvable question in a war built on answers no one can trust. In the cold calculus of espionage, where men are measured not by who they are, but by what they know, loyalty is traded like a hard currency, earned in silence, hoarded in secrets, and spent in whispers. But betrayal is different. Betrayal is fire, unpredictable and explosive. And when Viktor Baranov crossed that final threshold, he didn't just trade sides. He cracked the very foundation of the Cold War's brittle detente. His defection, a single act by a single man, unspooled decades of carefully layered trust, mutual deterrence, and silent agreements that kept the world from tipping into thermonuclear chaos. For all the summit tables and handshakes staged for cameras, the truth was always darker. There was no balance, only fear, and Viktor lit a match under it. In choosing to walk away from the Soviet apparatus he had served so loyally, he became the embodiment of everything both East and West feared most. A man whose conscience outweighed allegiance, whose mind carried weapons more dangerous than bombs. And yet, even now, decades later, with archives partially opened and old handlers long buried, no one truly knows if Viktor escaped into a new life, or if he was quietly erased to preserve the illusions both sides desperately needed to maintain. His act exposed the truth that neither superpower wanted to admit, that the Cold War was not some monolithic chess match of ideologies, but a fragile standoff held together by mistrust, suppression, and the unspoken rule that the game must never be interrupted. But Viktor interrupted it. He forced both systems to confront the rot within, to question their agents, their allies, even their own playbooks. He proved that one man, carrying nothing more than knowledge and conviction, could upend the balance of terror without firing a shot. And in doing so, he became a symbol not of heroism or villainy, but of risk. An unrepeatable reminder that the most dangerous weapon of the Cold War wasn't the missile silo or the spy satellite, but the moment when a trusted insider decided to stop playing by the rules. That's the true legacy of Viktor Baranov. Not just the arrests he triggered or the network he dismantled, but the silent panic he sowed in every secure office and surveillance van across the globe, the quiet shiver in every intelligence chief's spine when they ask themselves, what if there's another Viktor? What if it happens again? Because once the ice is cracked, you can never pretend it's solid. His betrayal wasn't just a blow to Moscow, it was a warning to everyone else, that the system was only as strong as its secrets, that faith could not be manufactured, that even in a war without bullets, a single act of conscience could set fire to the world. Whether he died nameless in a ditch or lived out his years behind another man's passport, Viktor Baranov taught both sides the price of betrayal. And that price, in the end, was trust, lost forever in the shadow of a man who simply chose not to lie anymore.